late 1940s, the field of psychology was interested in identifying people on the basis of mental illness and then figuring out what's wrong, right? Diagnosis, psychoses, neuroses, various forms of disorder behavior. And Dr. Hall and Dr. Clifton thought, well, what would happen instead if we identified people on the basis of success and figured out what's right with them? And when Dr. Hall came here to the university, Don Clifton was his graduate student, and they began to identify students in their classes who demonstrated what they called high human relations capital. Right, so they identified students who were successful at positive relationship building regardless of context. They wanted to figure out what was right with them and began to research them. Dr. Hall and Dr. Clifton, their faculty photos are in my office. And in the office, I look at them every day. And it means so much to me that I get to be able to spend time and effort continuing that legacy of figuring out what's right with students who have this high human relations capital. For 75 years, NHRI has sat on a living leadership laboratory. And so I am so pleased that I get to be in a position to say their stories should be shared to serve as inspiration for others and to also help us understand better what happens, what is the potency of mentoring. We know it is potent, but why? So I'm so honored that I get to be part of Dr. Hall and Dr. Clifton's work in figuring out what's right with students who have success in high human relations capital. So we talk in NHRI, any student who comes into NHRI, any family that comes into NHRI, we talk about how it's not just mentoring, it's an investment relationship, right? We use that word specifically because ultimately the intention is to prepare our leadership mentees to reinvest their own human relations capital in others. So I consider our research agenda to be understanding the dividends of that investment relationship and answering the question, what are the short and long-term outcomes of leadership mentoring? So I'll give you a little window into what we've been studying over the last 10 years or so. So the last 10 years we've been studying generativity, which sounds like a made-up word, but it refers to the care and concern one has for establishing and guiding the next generation. The reason I got turned on to generativity was because a faculty member out of Stanford, a guy named Jay Azzaro, who was in their executive leadership program, I was talking to him about what we do in NHRI, and he said, well, have you ever thought about generativity? And I'm like, what? And he said, look, there are a couple things that are really impactful about what you do in NHRI. He said, first of all, he said, you select college students, typically, as second semester freshmen, and then you have them mentor someone for 3 years. He goes, that's unusual. And he said, and then for your mentees, you select them, and then you make a commitment to them until they graduate from high school, working with a series of college students. He said, that's very generative in nature. And he said that's novel because young adults are not regarded as being highly generative, rather altruistic. Meaning college students, young adults are wonderful at doing the one-time act of do-gooding, right? The philanthropy day for the sorority or fraternity, the big event, the canned food drive, right? The one-time act of do-gooding. But he said young adults are not really regarded as highly generative, but rather college students are trying to figure out who they are and maybe who they're going to spend their life with, right? Trying to figure out those questions. Not really about generativity. He said, I think you could make a contribution there. So decades of generativity highlight this path, that people tend to peak in their ability to be generative when they're middle-aged, right? This age, I hate you a minute. This age, right? We're on the PTO, coaching the Little League, right? Doing a lot of generative things. So as we mentioned before, young adults not regarded as highly generative. So we felt like our first job was to figure out, are NHRI students more generative than their peers? So first, we compared NHRI students' generativity levels to college student leaders who were not mentoring. So think like NSC leaders or Greek House presidents. And then we also compared them to general college students. And what we found was, indeed, NHRI students are more generative than their peers. Now, this is not a shocker, right? They spent 3 years mentoring someone. We would expect them, perhaps, to be more generative than their peers. But why that finding is interesting is because of Alice Ross's work in 2001. So she did a comprehensive study of midlife using the MIDAS survey. And one of the major findings from that research project was that generativity emerged as the strongest predictor of social responsibility. So what that means is that the more someone has care and concern for establishing and guiding the next generation, the more likely they are to spend their time and money building a strong family, workplace, and community. So that's where it gets more interesting. So not only are NHRI students more generative than their peers, but then more likely to be community builders. Then I had a grad student, Hannah Sunderman, coming through her doctoral program, and I said, Hannah, perfect timing. Now we got to figure out if generativity grows within the NHRI experience, because we had also conducted interviews with the first study, and what I was hearing from seniors was that a lot of them said, I may have always been more generative, right? I wanted to be the Pee Wee wrestling coach. I wanted to babysit. I was maybe always more generative. But the other thing we heard was that while these students talked about how they may have come in with a seed of generativity, that NHRI was the soil and the sunlight and the water to make it grow. In fact, several students used the word laboratory, that NHRI was a laboratory for learning how to grow their generativity. And so Hannah did a longitudinal study, and what we found was that generative behavior went up over a 3-year period. So not only do our NHRI students more generative than their peers, but through the course of their NHRI experience, that generativity grows. Okay, because we were studying something that's really considered a midlife thing, a lot of the surveys associated with it are very midlife leaning, and so we did a lot of qualitative work on generativity. And what I love is that of all the qualitative things that we did, look, you're seeing this circle thing. We're going to talk about that in a second. So the thing we heard over and over and over again was students talking about how when they came into NHRI, it's like they had exposure to what this concept of generativity was. They got an opportunity to practice it through mentoring. They had an opportunity to reflect on it every week with their project members. But the coolest part was that what we heard in study after study after study was that these students said, when I got to see my mentee be generative, that gave me even more motivation to be generative myself. Talk about the ripple effect, right? How cool is that? You get to see your mentee be awesome, and you're like, I want to be even more awesome like my mentee, right? So I love this. We saw the concept of the ripple effect showing up in research over and over again. Love that. I will say too, one of the biggest blessings of this role as a research director is that I get to analyze data with NHRI students. I'm like, Addie, when I'm looking at you, Nick and I'm looking at you. There's so many times that we got to analyze data alongside NHRI students. So what I love is that not only do we get to do research, but I get to work alongside NHRI students. So it's almost like they're getting to see their own life and their own experience play out in the analysis of this data. Okay, so what we're working on next, some of you participated in focus groups yesterday, thank you. I love you. we need those data points. So, relative to generativity research, now we're trying to figure out what is the lifespan trajectory of generativity for NHRI logs. We used some interesting degree of change graphing yesterday to look at lifespan trajectories. But we're also trying to think beyond generativity. What do NHRI alumni, what kinds of things do they identify? We call it sort of exploratory outcome modeling. And what were some of the trajectories that they hold for the things that they identified? Nick and Opic, one of my favorite moments with Nick and Opic, we had a bunch of pilot study data where we were using this degree of change graphing, and it was really hard to create themes from it. I mean, everybody was starting in a different place, doing different trajectories. I didn't know what to do with that data. As Nick and I were talking, like, you know what, let's hone in on inflection points. And Nick dove in to all the graphs, and he picked out all the inflection points when that was happening. By the way, what was interesting about some of that pilot work, and I can share this now because some of you who are in the focus groups, we have your data now, so I'm not going to bias your thinking anymore, hopefully. But what was fascinating, some of these major inflection points happened in year two or year 3 of mentoring, just showing that some of the effects happen in longer term commitments to mentoring relationships, which I think is fascinating. We're also trying to understand what turns the temperature up or down, the slope, right, of generative growth. And we also want to know a lot more about our leadership mentees. we're hypothesizing that there's this sort of spiraling relationship between leadership identity and leadership competency development. As in, like, if I see myself as a leader at 12, does that mean I'm more likely to seek out more opportunities to develop my leadership? And then by virtue of that, do I see myself even more so as a leader? So we're hypothesizing this spiraling relationship. And I love that I also get to work with NHRI alum Alex Roderson, who quantitative science PhD from University of Notre Dame. He's legit. He's legit. So I get to like hang out with him, and he builds me pretty figures like this. So we're trying to figure out how to do longitudinal work using actually it's called an accelerated longitudinal cohort model, where we have overlapping cohorts. So we're also trying to advance how we approach some of these things methodologically, so we can study youth over time in ways that make sense from the data collection perspective. Okay. Okay. And please know I will be around to answer any questions about the research. Hopefully you found it as interesting as I do. I realize maybe not everyone loves data. As much as I do, that's okay. But Nick, are you up next?